Dr. Daniel Carter stared at the screen in front of him and felt his heart begin to race faster than it had in 15 long years of deep space research. The probe had returned from the debris field surrounding the fourth planet in the Kepler 442 system, and what it brought back changed everything he thought he knew about the universe and humanity's place in it. The object floating in the darkness was massive and crystalline and pulsed with a faint blue light that seemed almost alive. It sat there in the ruins of what had once been an orbital station, and Daniel knew without any doubt that this was the discovery of a lifetime. Lieutenant Commander Amy Brooks worked beside him at the control station, and her fingers moved quickly across the holographic interface as she tried to establish a connection with the alien structure. She had been working on the horizon's edge for 3 years now, and had never seen anything quite like this before. The security protocols protecting the structure were complex and beautiful in a way that human encryption could never match. They had been designed by minds that thought in patterns completely foreign to human understanding. Amy felt sweat bead on her forehead as she worked through layer after layer of protection, but she refused to give up because this was too important to fail. Captain Helen Price stood behind them with her arms crossed over her chest and watched the process with patient eyes. She had commanded the horizon's edge through countless missions into unexplored space, and had learned long ago that patience was more valuable than haste when dealing with the unknown. The ship hummed quietly around them, and the crew at their various stations maintained their focus on their tasks, while stealing glances at the main screen whenever they thought no one was looking. Everyone knew that something important was happening, even if they did not yet understand exactly what it meant. Amy suddenly let out a breath she had been holding and looked up at Daniel with wide eyes. She spoke in a whisper that somehow seemed too loud in the quiet of the bridge. She told him that she was in, and that the connection was stable, and that they could begin downloading the data whenever Captain Price gave the order. Helen stepped forward and placed a hand on Amy's shoulder, and told her to proceed, but to do it carefully because they had no idea what they were dealing with, and caution was always better than speed when first contact with alien technology was involved. The data began to flow into the ship's secure systems, and Daniel watched the progress bars climb higher and higher as gigabytes became terabytes and terabytes became petabytes of information. The archive was enormous and contained more data than they could possibly analyze in months or even years. He pulled up the preliminary analysis results and felt his mouth go dry as he read what the computer was telling him. The archive contained historical records from not just one extinct civilization, but 17 different species that had once traveled the stars and built great empires, and then vanished from the galaxy as if they had never existed at all. Amy zoomed in on a section of the data and began running translation algorithms through the ship's AI system. The languages were completely alien, but the AI was good at finding patterns and making connections between symbols and meanings. It worked for 20 minutes while everyone on the bridge waited in tense silence. When the first translations began appearing on the screen, Amy felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Every record and every historical entry and every desperate final message contained the same phrase repeated over and over, again in dozens of different alien languages. Daniel asked the computer to translate the recurring phrase into English, and when the words appeared on the screen, the bridge fell into absolute silence. The phrase translated to "They are awake" in every single language and every single context. It appeared in historical records from civilizations that had died millions of years apart and had never known of each other's existence. It appeared in scientific reports and military logs and personal journals. It appeared in the final transmissions sent by dying worlds as their populations were wiped out by something terrible and unstoppable. Captain Price ordered the data transfer to continue and told her crew to maintain their positions, while she called an emergency meeting of the senior staff. Daniel and Amy followed her to the conference room along with Commander Jake Morrison, who served as the ship's military strategist, and Dr. Lisa Grant, who was their lead xenobiologist. They sat around the table in uncomfortable silence while Helen pulled up images from the archive on the large screen that dominated one wall of the room. The images showed cities burning and ships exploding in space, and worlds reduced to lifeless rock. They showed symbols and writing that the translation software was still working to decode. They showed star maps marking the locations of dead civilizations scattered across a specific region of the galaxy. Helen told them that they needed to understand what they were looking at, and they needed to understand it quickly, because if these records were accurate, then humanity might be facing a threat unlike anything they had ever imagined. Jake leaned forward and studied the star maps with the practiced eye of someone trained to recognize patterns in tactical data. He pointed out that the dead civilizations were clustered together in a rough sphere that measured approximately 2,000 light-years across. Every species that had died was located within this zone, and no records existed of any civilization surviving once they reached a certain level of technological advancement. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence and too widespread to be the result of natural disaster or plague. Lisa pulled up biological data from the archives and began running it through her analysis programs. She told the others that she was finding genetic information from dozens of species and that the diversity was staggering. These had been peoples as different from each other as humans were from insects, and yet they had all suffered the same fate. She noted that many of the species had been spacefaring for thousands of years before their extinction and had developed technologies that humanity was only beginning to understand. Whatever had killed them was not something primitive or easy to defeat. Daniel spoke quietly and told them about the Torvin Collective, which appeared to be the last civilization to fall within the zone. The Torvin had left behind detailed records of their final years and had apparently known that they were doomed long before the end came. They had built this archive specifically as a warning to whoever might come after them. They had hidden it in the Kepler 442 system, which was far outside the danger zone, and had programmed it to respond to signs of intelligent life. The archive was meant to be found, and its contents were meant to save lives. Captain Price asked the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. She asked if humanity was in danger, and if the same force that had destroyed 17 civilizations might now be coming for Earth. Daniel looked at the star maps again and felt his stomach twist into knots. He told her that based on the Torvin records, humanity had been broadcasting radio signals into space for over 200 years and had been using faster-than-light communication for decades. If the pattern held true, then yes, they were in terrible danger, and they might already be running out of time. The weeks that followed the discovery blurred together into an endless cycle of research and analysis and growing dread. Daniel spent every waking hour diving deeper into the Torvin archive, while Amy worked beside him to decode and translate the massive amounts of data they had recovered. The Horizon's Edge remained anchored in the Kepler 442 system, and Captain Price made the decision to keep them there until they understood exactly what they were dealing with. The crew understood the importance of their mission, and no one complained about the delay in returning home, even though many of them were worried about what they were learning. Commander Jake Morrison joined the research team after the third day, when it became clear that military expertise would be needed to understand the tactical information buried in the archives. He had spent 20 years in Earth's defense forces and had studied every major conflict in human history, but nothing had prepared him for what he found in the alien records. The civilizations that had died were not primitive or unprepared for war. They had possessed weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand star-level energy outputs. They had fought with everything they had, and they had still lost. The pattern emerged slowly like a picture coming into focus through fog. Each of the 17 civilizations had followed almost the same path to destruction, and the similarities were impossible to ignore. They had all reached a certain threshold of technological advancement that involved faster-than-light travel or communication or both. Within decades of achieving this milestone, their exploratory vessels began disappearing at the edges of their territory. The disappearances started small, with just 1 or 2 ships vanishing without a trace. Then the numbers grew larger, and the attacks moved closer to populated systems. Amy created a 3-dimensional map that showed the progression of attacks for each civilization and projected it onto the main screen in the conference room. The senior staff gathered to watch as she played through the data like a horrible movie that ended the same way every single time. The attacks always followed the same pattern, starting at the outer edges of a civilization's territory and working inward in a methodical spiral. Outlying colonies were hit first, and their populations were wiped out completely, with no survivors and no bodies left behind. Military forces rushed to defend the colonies, but found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to learn from every encounter. and adapted to every defensive strategy. Jake pointed out that the time between first contact and final extinction varied between civilizations, but the average was around 30 years. 30 years from the first disappearing ship to the complete annihilation of an entire species, and everything they had built. Some civilizations had lasted longer because they had been more spread out across multiple star systems. Others had fallen faster because they had concentrated their population on a few core worlds. But in the end, the result was always the same, and none of them had survived to tell their own story. Dr. Lisa Grant focused her attention on the biological and medical data contained in the archives, and what she found made her hands shake as she typed her reports. The enemy that had destroyed these civilizations was called by many names, but the description was always eerily similar. They arrived in ships that seemed to absorb energy weapons and shrugged off kinetic impacts that should have torn them apart. Their technology adapted in real time to whatever defenses were thrown at them. They never attempted communication and never responded to offers of peace or surrender. They simply killed everything intelligent they encountered and moved on to the next target. The Torvan records were the most detailed, because they had apparently suspected their doom was coming, and had devoted enormous resources to studying their enemy. They called them the Harbingers, and had managed to capture fragmentary sensor data from the few ships that survived encounters with them. Lisa studied this data for days and presented her findings during a briefing that left everyone in the room feeling sick. She told them that the Harbingers did not conquer or subjugate or assimilate the species they encountered. They did not take prisoners or steal resources or occupy territory. They simply eradicated all intelligent life down to the last individual, and then disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived. Captain Price asked the question that had been haunting all of them since they first understood what the archive contained. She asked if humanity was next, and if there was anything they could do to prevent the same fate from befalling Earth and all the colonies humanity had established across dozens of star systems. Daniel pulled up the final entries from the Torvan archive, and the room fell silent as they read the desperate words of a dying civilization. The Torvan had detected something in their final years that they believed was the key to understanding why the Harbingers existed and what triggered their attacks. The Torvan scientists had discovered that the Harbingers appeared to respond to a specific type of signal that was generated whenever a species reached a certain level of technological sophistication. The signal was not intentional, and civilizations did not even know they were broadcasting it. It was simply a byproduct of the quantum entanglement technology used in faster-than-light communication systems. The Torvan theorized that the Harbingers were waiting somewhere in deep space and listening for these signals. When a new signal appeared, they investigated, and if they determined that the civilization posed a potential threat, then they launched their attack. Jake pulled up Earth's history of space broadcasts and faster-than-light communication and laid it out on the screen for everyone to see. Humanity had been broadcasting radio waves into space since the early 20th century and had developed quantum entanglement communication 30 years ago. If the Torvan theory was correct, then the Harbingers already knew about humanity and might already be on their way. The question was not if they would come, but when and how much time humanity had to prepare for their arrival. Amy discovered something buried deep in the archive that gave them a small measure of hope, even as it confirmed their worst fears. One civilization called the Krell had managed to fight back against the Harbingers with some success, before ultimately falling. The Krell had been a massive militaristic empire that spanned 40 star systems and maintained a standing military force larger than anything humanity could imagine. When the Harbingers came, the Krell had been ready, and they fought with savage determination for 30 years. The Krell battle records showed that the Harbingers were not completely invincible, despite their advanced technology and adaptive capabilities. The Krell had discovered that the Harbinger ships relied on a distributed network intelligence that allowed them to coordinate perfectly and share information instantaneously across vast distances. When the network was disrupted using focused, quantum interference fields, the Harbinger ships became vulnerable and could be destroyed. The Krell had managed to destroy dozens of Harbinger vessels using this technique before they were finally overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Lieutenant Sam Cooper studied the Krell weapon specifications with intense focus and compared them to Earth's current military technology. He told the group that humanity was developing similar quantum disruption systems for next-generation defensive platforms. The technology was still experimental, but it was theoretically capable of producing the same effects the Krell had achieved. If they had enough time, they might be able to weaponize it and give Earth's defense forces a fighting chance against the Harbingers. Lisa brought everyone back to reality with a sobering analysis of the Krell's ultimate fate. She pointed out that despite their military might and their discovery of the Harbinger's weakness, the Krell had still lost. They had thrown thousands of ships into battle and deployed weapons capable of destroying entire planets, and they had only managed to take out a fraction of the Harbinger fleet before their civilization collapsed. Even if humanity could replicate the Krell's success, it might not be enough to ensure survival. Captain Price made the decision to send an encrypted message to Earth Command using the ship's quantum communication system. The message contained a summary of everything they had learned and recommendations for immediate action. She stressed that humanity needed to begin preparing for the possibility of attack, but also warned against causing widespread panic that might destabilize governments and societies. The response from Earth came back within hours and carried the highest security classification possible. Earth Command ordered the Horizon's Edge to maintain complete communication silence until they returned home. The information they carried was too valuable and too dangerous to risk being intercepted or leaked before proper preparations could be made. The ship was to proceed directly to Earth at maximum speed and avoid contact with all other vessels along the way. When they arrived, Daniel and his team would brief the highest levels of government and military leadership about the threat humanity faced. The Horizon's Edge began its journey home 3 days later, and the crew settled into the familiar routine of long-distance space travel. But there was a tension aboard the ship that had not been there before, and everyone felt the weight of what they knew. They had discovered the truth about the galaxy, and learned that humanity was not alone in the universe. But they had also learned that being noticed might be the worst thing that could ever happen to their species, and that the silence of space might hide horrors beyond human imagination. The journey back to Earth took 4 months, and every day felt longer than the last. Daniel spent most of his time in the research lab continuing to analyze the Torvin archive because he could not shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Amy worked alongside him, running translation programs and cross-referencing data from different civilizations to find connections that might help humanity survive what was coming. The archive was so vast that they had barely scratched the surface. Despite weeks of constant work and new discoveries emerged almost daily, Jake divided his time between studying the Krell battle records and working with Sam to develop theoretical combat strategies against the Harbingers. They ran countless simulations using the ship's computer, and every single one ended the same way, with humanity losing badly. The numbers were simply too overwhelming, and even if Earth's defense forces could replicate the Krell's quantum disruption technology, they would still be facing an enemy that had wiped out civilizations far more advanced and militaristic than humanity had ever been. Lisa focused on understanding the Harbingers themselves, and spent hours examining the biological and technical data that various civilizations had managed to gather before their extinction. She was looking for any weakness or pattern that might give humanity an advantage, but the more she learned, the more frightened she became. The Harbingers were not like anything humanity had encountered before, and they did not follow the rules that governed normal biological or technological development. They were something else entirely, and Lisa was beginning to suspect that they might not even be truly alive in any sense that humans would recognize. Captain Price maintained the ship's heading toward Earth and kept the crew focused on their duties, even though everyone knew what they were carrying home. The burden of knowledge weighed heavily on all of them, and there were times when Helen wished they had never found the archive at all. Ignorance might have been bliss, but it was too late now, and humanity deserved to know the truth about the universe they lived in. She only hoped that Earth's leaders would have the wisdom to use the information properly and prepare for what was coming without tearing society apart in the process. Daniel made a breakthrough during the 3rd month of their journey, when he discovered a hidden layer of data buried deep within the archive. The Torvin had apparently known more about the Harbingers than they had included in their main records, and had encrypted this additional information behind multiple layers of security. It took Daniel and Amy working together for 2 weeks to crack the encryption, but when they finally succeeded, what they found changed everything they thought they understood. The hidden data revealed that the Torvin had managed to capture a damaged Harbinger ship during one of their battles and had studied it extensively before it self-destructed. What they learned was both fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. The Harbinger vessels were not built in any conventional sense, but were grown using a form of technology that blended organic and mechanical components in ways that should have been impossible. The ships could repair themselves and adapt to new threats and share information with other Harbinger vessels instantaneously across any distance. But the most disturbing discovery was that the Harbingers themselves were not individual entities, but were instead extensions of a single vast intelligence that existed across multiple dimensions. Each ship was like a finger on a hand, and destroying one ship did not hurt the greater intelligence any more than cutting off a fingernail would hurt a human. The Torvan scientists had theorized that this was why the Harbingers never communicated and never showed mercy. They were not conscious beings making choices, but were instead tools being used by something far larger and more incomprehensible. Amy brought up a section of the Torvan data that sent chills down Daniel's spine when he read it. The Torvan had detected unusual quantum fluctuations in deep space during their final years, and had sent several research vessels to investigate. None of those vessels ever returned, but the data they transmitted before losing contact suggested that they had found something massive waiting in the darkness between galaxies. The Torvan theorized that this was the source of the Harbingers, and that it was still out there watching and waiting for new civilizations to reveal themselves. Jake wanted to know if the Torvan had discovered any way to communicate with or negotiate with the Harbingers, but Daniel shook his head and explained that every attempt at communication had been ignored. The Harbingers did not respond to radio signals or laser pulses or quantum messages. They did not acknowledge surrender offers or peace proposals. They simply arrived and began their work of extermination with mechanical efficiency. The only thing that slowed them down was military resistance, and even that only delayed the inevitable rather than preventing it. Lisa made her own disturbing discovery while analyzing the biological samples that various civilizations had managed to collect from Harbinger ships. She found genetic markers and protein structures that did not match anything in nature and appeared to have been deliberately engineered. The Harbingers were artificial creations built by someone or something with technology far beyond anything the 17 dead civilizations had possessed. Lisa theorized that the Harbingers might be millions or even billions of years old and might have been created as weapons during some ancient conflict that no one remembered anymore. The implications were staggering and horrifying. Humanity was not facing a natural predator or even a hostile alien civilization. They were facing an ancient weapon system that was still carrying out its original programming long after its creators had probably died or disappeared. The Harbingers were not evil or cruel because they were not capable of such emotions. They were simply doing what they had been designed to do, and nothing would stop them from completing their mission. Captain Price called an emergency meeting of the senior staff to discuss these new findings, and everyone gathered in the conference room with grim faces. Helen asked Daniel to present everything they had learned, and to give his honest assessment of humanity's chances of survival. Daniel stood at the head of the table and pulled up charts and data on the screen behind him. He explained the nature of the Harbingers and the theory that they were ancient weapons, still following their original directives. He showed them the quantum fluctuations the Torvan had detected, and the massive presence waiting in deep space. Then Daniel told them something that made everyone in the room fall silent. He explained that based on the pattern from all 17 civilizations, humanity should have already been attacked. The Harbingers typically appeared within 5 to 10 years of a civilization developing faster than light communication. Humanity had possessed that technology for 3 decades, and yet the Harbingers had not come. Something was different about Earth and humanity, and Daniel did not know if that was good news or bad news. Jake suggested that maybe humanity had simply been lucky so far, and that the Harbingers had been busy elsewhere in the galaxy. Amy proposed that maybe Earth was too far from the danger zone, and the Harbingers had not detected humanity's signals yet. Lisa wondered if perhaps something about human biology or technology was different enough that the Harbingers did not recognize humanity as a threat. But Daniel had a darker theory that he was afraid to voice. He finally spoke and told them that he thought the Harbingers knew about humanity and had known for years. He believed they were waiting for something, and that humanity's survival so far was not luck but was instead part of some larger pattern they did not yet understand. The Torvin data suggested that the Harbingers were not random killers, but were, instead, following specific criteria when choosing their targets. If humanity had not been attacked yet, it was because they did not yet meet whatever conditions triggered a Harbinger response. Captain Price asked what could possibly make humanity different from the 17 civilizations that had been destroyed. Daniel admitted that he did not know, but that he intended to find out before they reached Earth. He had 4 more weeks to search the archive, and he would spend every minute of that time looking for answers. The meeting ended, and everyone returned to their duties, but the questions lingered in all their minds. 2 weeks before they were scheduled to reach Earth, the horizon's edge crossed into human-controlled space, and their long-range sensors picked up something that made Captain Price immediately order the ship to battle stations. 3 vessels matching the exact specifications described in the Torvin archive were positioned near Proxima Centauri. The ships were massive and dark and absorbed light instead of reflecting it. They hung motionless in space like predators waiting for prey, and their weapon systems were active and tracking every human ship in the system. The Harbingers had arrived, and humanity's time had run out. The horizon's edge reached Earth 3 days after detecting the Harbinger ships at Proxima Centauri, and the planet below was already preparing for war. Military vessels filled the orbital space around Earth in numbers that Daniel had never seen before, and construction crews worked around the clock building new defensive platforms and weapon systems. Captain Price brought the ship into dock at the largest military station orbiting Earth, and within an hour, Daniel and his team were escorted to an emergency briefing with the highest levels of government and military command. The briefing room was packed with generals and admirals and scientists and politicians who all wanted to know what humanity was facing. Daniel stood at the front of the room with Amy and Jake and Lisa beside him and began presenting everything they had learned from the Torvin archive. He showed them images of dead civilizations and burning worlds and explained the pattern that had repeated itself 17 times across the galaxy. He told them about the Harbingers and their nature as ancient, weapons still following programming. From a war that had ended billions of years ago, Admiral George Harris listened to the presentation with the calm expression of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of threat. He was the commander of Earth's entire defense fleet, and had already been briefed on the basics of what the horizon's edge had discovered. Now he wanted details, and he wanted to know exactly what humanity was up against and what chance they had of surviving. When Daniel finished his presentation, the Admiral asked the only question that really mattered, which was how long humanity had before the Harbingers attacked. Jake stepped forward and pulled up the data from all 17 civilizations showing the timeline. Between first detection and final assault, he explained that based on the pattern they had, 3 to 6 months before the Harbingers would begin their attack. The enemy ships at Proxima Centauri were in what appeared to be an observation phase studying humanity and gathering information. Once they decided that humanity met their criteria for extermination, they would move quickly and decisively. Jake estimated that Earth had perhaps 4 months to prepare, and that might not be enough time. Secretary of Defense Karen Mills stood up and asked how humanity was supposed to fight an enemy that had destroyed 17 civilizations, far more advanced than Earth. She pointed out that the Krell had possessed weapons that could crack planets and ships that numbered in the thousands, and they had still lost. What chance did humanity have with their comparatively primitive technology and smaller fleet? The question hung in the air, and Daniel could see the fear and frustration on the faces of everyone in the room. Amy spoke up and reminded them that humanity had something none of the other civilizations had possessed. They had the complete history and tactical data from 17 failed attempts to stop the Harbingers. They knew what strategies had been tried and what had worked even temporarily, and what had failed completely. The Krell had discovered that quantum disruption fields could damage Harbinger ships, and humanity already had similar technology in development. If they could weaponize it quickly enough, they might be able to hurt the Harbingers in ways that previous civilizations could not. President Victor Lang asked if there was any possibility of negotiation or diplomacy, and whether humanity should attempt to communicate with the Harbingers before assuming that war was inevitable. Daniel shook his head and explained that every civilization in the archive had tried to communicate, and every single attempt had been ignored. The Harbingers did not negotiate or accept surrender or show mercy. They were not conscious beings making moral choices, but were instead ancient machines following their programming. Talking to them would be like trying to negotiate with an asteroid or a storm. Lisa presented her findings about the biological nature of the Harbingers and explained her theory that they were engineered weapons created millions of years ago. She showed the genetic data and protein structures that did not match anything found in nature. She explained that the Harbingers might not even have a homeworld or a civilization backing them. They could be orphaned weapons still carrying out orders from creators who had died or disappeared long ago. The revelation that humanity was fighting ghosts from an ancient war did nothing to comfort anyone in the room. Admiral Harris made the decision that would shape humanity's response to the threat. He announced that Earth would pursue a two-pronged strategy of public misdirection and private preparation. The general population would be told that unusual astronomical phenomena near Proxima Centauri required increased military presence and study. This would explain the military buildup without causing the kind of widespread panic that could destabilize society. Meanwhile, every available resource would be devoted to developing weapons and defenses based on the Krell specifications found in the archive. The meeting continued for 6 hours as various departments presented their plans and capabilities. The military outlined how they would retrofit the entire fleet with quantum disruption weapons within 3 months. Scientists explained their research into the Harbinger technology and their attempts to find additional weaknesses. Intelligence services discussed protocols for maintaining secrecy while preparing the population for possible evacuation or shelter scenarios. Everyone understood that they were racing against a clock that was counting down to humanity's possible extinction. Daniel returned to his quarters after the meeting feeling exhausted and overwhelmed by the weight of what was happening. He had spent his entire career studying dead civilizations and ancient ruins, and now he was watching his own species prepare to become another entry in that long list of failures. He could not sleep, so he went back to the lab and continued analyzing the archive, looking for anything they might have missed. Amy found him there 3 hours later, staring at his screen with bloodshot eyes. She asked him what he was looking for, and Daniel told her that he was searching for hope. Somewhere in these millions of records there had to be something that explained why some civilizations lasted longer than others, or what factors determined who the Harbingers targeted first. There had to be a pattern within the pattern that they were missing. Amy sat down beside him, and together they began going through the data again with fresh eyes, looking for connections they had not seen before. Jake spent his time working with military strategists to develop combat doctrines for fighting the Harbingers. They ran simulation after simulation, testing different fleet formations and weapon combinations and tactical approaches. Most of the simulations ended in defeat, but occasionally they found strategies that allowed human forces to survive longer or inflict more damage. Jake documented everything and shared it with the fleet commanders who were training their crews for the battle to come. Lisa led a team of scientists in studying the biological samples and technical specifications from the archive. They were trying to understand how the Harbingers functioned at a fundamental level and whether there were any biological or chemical weapons that might affect them. The research was slow and frustrating because the Harbingers were unlike anything that existed in nature. Their biology, if it could even be called that, operated on principles that seemed to violate several laws of physics and chemistry. 2 months passed, and the Harbinger ships remained at Proxima Centauri observing and waiting. Earth's orbital space became crowded with new defensive platforms, and the fleet grew larger as older ships were retrofitted with quantum disruption weapons. Training exercises ran constantly, and every military base on Earth and throughout the colonies operated at full capacity. The public was starting to ask questions about the military buildup, but the official story about astronomical phenomena held for. Now Daniel made a discovery during the 8th week that changed everything. He thought he understood. He was working late in the lab when he found a hidden partition in the archive that he had somehow missed during his previous searches. The partition was sealed behind layers of encryption that had taken the ship's computer weeks to crack. Inside was a message that was not from the Torvin, but from something much older. The translation was rough and filtered through multiple alien languages, but the meaning was clear enough to make Daniel's hands shake as he read it. The message warned that the Harbingers had been created to prevent something called the Architects from awakening. The architects were described as beings of immense power who had ruled the galaxy billions of years ago and who viewed biological life as a threat to universal order. They had been defeated and sealed away in pocket dimensions by a coalition of ancient civilizations. The Harbingers were the guardians meant to ensure the seals remained intact. But something had gone wrong, and the Harbingers had begun killing any civilization that reached a certain level of advancement because their technology resonated with the frequencies that could weaken the seals. Daniel read the final line of the message 3 times before he fully understood what it meant. The message said that the Harbingers had failed in their mission, and that the architects were already beginning to wake. What came next would make the Harbingers seem like a mercy. Daniel sat back in his chair and felt the weight of this new knowledge crush down on him. They had thought the Harbingers were the ultimate threat, but they were only the beginning. Something far worse was waiting in the darkness, and humanity had no idea how to stop it. Daniel spent 3 days trying to verify the information about the architects before he finally brought it to Admiral Harris and the senior command staff. The hidden message was fragmentary and had been translated through so many alien languages that he wanted to be absolutely certain he understood it correctly before causing more panic. Amy helped him cross-reference the data with other sections of the archive, and they found supporting evidence scattered throughout the records of different civilizations. The architects were real and they were waking up, and the Harbingers were trying to stop it by eliminating any species whose technology might accelerate the awakening process. The emergency briefing that followed was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. Admiral Harris listened to the presentation in silence, and when Daniel finished, the Admiral simply sat there for a long moment, staring at the data on the screen. Finally, he asked the question that everyone was thinking, which was whether humanity should be more afraid of the Harbingers or the architects. Daniel admitted that he did not know because the archive contained almost no information about what the architects were actually capable of doing. The ancient civilizations that had sealed them away billions of years ago had left no detailed records, and the Harbingers themselves did not communicate. 3 days after Daniel's briefing, the Harbinger ships moved. Military sensors detected the massive vessels disappearing from Proxima Centauri in a flash of distorted space-time that left no trace of their presence. For 6 hours, Earth's defense forces waited on high alert, expecting an attack that never came. Then the sensors picked up the Harbinger ships again, and this time they were much closer. All 3 vessels had positioned themselves in orbit around Earth itself, hanging. They're like dark omens against the stars. Admiral Harris immediately scrambled every available ship, and within an hour, Earth was surrounded by a defensive sphere of hundreds of vessels, all equipped with the new quantum disruption weapons. The Harbingers made no aggressive moves and did not respond to any attempts at communication. They simply sat there in orbit, scanning the planet below with sensor sweeps that military intelligence detected, but could not block. Jake told the Admiral that based on the archive records, this scanning phase usually lasted between 1 and 3 weeks. Before the Harbingers began their attack, Daniel was brought to the military command center along with Amy and Lisa and Jake. They stood in front of a massive display showing the tactical situation, with the 3 Harbinger ships highlighted in red and the human defense fleet in blue. Captain Price was there as well, having been temporarily assigned to the command staff as an advisor on the Harbinger threat. They watched the standoff unfold, and everyone in the room felt the terrible tension of waiting for an enemy to make the first move. Amy noticed something strange about the sensor data coming from the Harbinger ships. The scanning patterns they were using were not the same as the ones described in the Krell battle records. The Harbingers seemed to be searching for something specific, rather than conducting a general survey of Earth's defenses and population centers. She brought this to Daniel's attention, and they spent 2 hours analyzing the scan patterns, trying to understand what the Harbingers were looking for. Daniel suddenly understood what was happening, and he felt his heart begin to race. He turned to Admiral Harris and told him that the Harbingers were not preparing to attack Earth. They were searching for evidence that humanity knew about the architects. The scan patterns matched the frequencies that would detect quantum computing systems and faster-than-light communication arrays in advanced physics research facilities. The Harbingers were trying to determine whether humanity posed a threat to the seals holding the architects in their dimensional prisons. Admiral Harris asked what would happen if the Harbingers decided that humanity was a threat. Daniel told him that based on the archive records, the attack would begin within hours, and Earth would have perhaps a few days before the planet was completely sterilized of all intelligent life. But if the Harbingers determined that humanity was not a threat, or better yet that humanity could be an ally, then there might be a chance for survival. The Admiral asked how they could possibly communicate that to the Harbingers when every previous attempt at communication had been ignored. Daniel had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. He told the Admiral that every previous civilization had tried to communicate using their own languages and mathematical systems. But humanity had something unique, which was the complete archive from the Torvin, including all the translation keys and historical records. If they broadcast a message using the mathematical and linguistic patterns from the archive itself, the Harbingers might recognize it and understand that humanity possessed knowledge of the greater threat. Admiral Harris made a decision that would determine the fate of humanity. He ordered the defense fleet to stand down from attack posture while maintaining defensive positions. Then he authorized Daniel to broadcast a message directly to the Harbinger vessels, using every communication system Earth possessed. The message was simple, and used the mathematical keys and linguistic patterns that Daniel had extracted from the deepest layers of the archive. It said that humanity knew about the architects and understood the mission of the Harbingers and wanted to help, rather than hinder their work. For 6 hours nothing happened, and Daniel began to think that his plan had failed. Then the Harbinger ships responded, and for the first time in recorded history they actually communicated with another species. The response came not in words but in pure data that flooded Earth's communication networks with information. Amy and her team worked frantically to process and translate the massive data dump. What emerged was a story that rewrote everything humanity thought they knew about the universe. The Harbingers explained through data and images and mathematical proofs that they had been created by a coalition of ancient civilizations to guard against the return of the architects. The architects had been beings of incredible power who existed partially outside normal space-time, and who viewed biological consciousness as a threat to the fundamental order of the universe. They had tried to reshape reality itself to eliminate biological life, but had been defeated and imprisoned by the combined efforts of dozens of ancient species working together. The seals holding the architects had been designed to last forever, but nothing truly lasted forever in a universe governed by entropy and decay. Over billions of years, the seals had weakened, and certain types of technology, particularly quantum entanglement and dimensional manipulation, could accelerate that weakening. The Harbingers had been programmed to eliminate any civilization that developed such technology before they could accidentally free the architects. It was not cruelty, but desperate necessity that drove them to kill. Lisa read through the biological data the Harbingers provided and found the answer to a question that had haunted her for months. The Harbingers were indeed artificial constructs created by blending organic and mechanical systems in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. They were designed to last for billions of years and to adapt to any threat they encountered. But they were also deteriorating slowly as the eons passed, and their numbers were far fewer than they had been when first created. The 3 ships orbiting Earth were possibly the last functional Harbinger vessels remaining in this entire region of the galaxy. The Harbingers then showed humanity, something that made everyone in the command center fall silent. They transmitted coordinates for 17 locations scattered across known space, where the dimensional seals holding the architects were weakening. Several of the seals were already showing signs of catastrophic failure, and the architects trapped within were beginning to push through into normal space-time. The Harbingers estimated that full containment breach would occur within 50 to 100 years, unless something was done to reinforce the seals. Admiral Harris asked the Harbingers why they had not simply destroyed humanity, like they had destroyed the other 17 civilizations. The response was illuminating and gave Daniel hope for the first time since this nightmare began. The Harbingers explained that humanity had done something unique by finding the Torvin archive and learning from it. The archive contained information about the architects that the Harbingers had not been able to communicate to other species. By possessing this knowledge, humanity had demonstrated the ability to understand the greater threat and potentially help rather than hinder the effort to keep the architects contained. The Harbingers made humanity an offer that no species in recorded history had ever received. They would share their technology and knowledge with Earth in exchange for humanity, joining them in their eternal mission to guard the dimensional seals. Humanity would have to accept certain restrictions on their technological development, particularly in areas that could weaken the seals. But in return, they would gain access to science and engineering that was billions of years more advanced than anything humans had dreamed possible. President Lang called an emergency session of the United Earth Council, and the debate that followed lasted for 3 days. Some argued that humanity should reject the offer and maintain complete independence, even if it meant facing the Harbingers as enemies. Others pointed out that the architects represented a threat far greater than anything the Harbingers could do, and that survival required cooperation. In the end, the vote was nearly unanimous in favor of accepting the Harbinger offer. The months that followed transformed human civilization in ways that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The Harbingers shared technical specifications for quantum seal detection systems and showed human engineers how to build devices that could monitor and reinforce the dimensional barriers holding the architects. They revealed the locations of ancient installations left behind by the civilizations that had first imprisoned the architects, and helped humanity understand how those systems worked. Daniel and Amy found themselves leading a new organization called the Sentinel Initiative that was tasked with studying the archives and preparing humanity for its role as guardians. They recruited scientists and engineers and soldiers from across all human colonies and began training them in the knowledge contained within the Torvin records. The work was difficult and sometimes frightening, as they learned just how vast and incomprehensible the architects truly were. Jake worked with military planners to integrate Harbinger defensive technology into Earth's fleet. The quantum disruption weapons that had been developed to fight the Harbingers were instead modified to strengthen dimensional seals. Human ships began patrolling the locations where seals were weakest, working alongside the ancient Harbinger vessels to monitor for signs of breach. Lisa led research teams studying the biological and dimensional nature of the architects, trying to understand what they were and what they wanted. The information in the archives suggested that the architects were not evil in any conventional sense, but were instead beings whose fundamental nature was incompatible with biological life. They existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously and viewed consciousness as a form of chaos that disrupted the perfect mathematical order they sought to maintain. 1 year after first contact with the Harbingers, Daniel stood in the observation deck of a new station built specifically to monitor one of the dimensional seals. Through the windows, he could see human and Harbinger ships working together to install new reinforcement generators around a point in space where reality itself seemed to shimmer and warp. Amy stood beside him, and they watched in silence as two species that should have been enemies instead became allies against a common threat. Daniel thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had set out to study dead civilizations and had instead discovered humanity's true purpose in the universe. The 17 extinct species had not died in vain, because their records had given humanity the knowledge needed to survive first contact with the Harbingers. And now humanity would help ensure that no other species would have to face extinction for the crime of reaching for the stars. The awakening had begun not just for the architects, but for humanity as well, and the future stretched ahead full of challenge and danger and hope.